Hi, my name is Shanae Sampson. I'm a first year graduate student here at Fayetteville State in the Masters of Arts of Teaching program. My major is elementary education with a concentration in math. Most recently, I've been a substitute teacher, um, long term assignment at J.W. Seabrook in Cedar Creek. That is a very diverse school. So, this multicultural education class and diverse learning is something that really does interest me. Additionally, I came to this country as an international student, and I really believe in being able to connect with all of our students, regardless of their background, and to put everyone on a level playing field so that children can seek success and achieve a success. Um, Actually, I just accepted a job at Cumberland Mills Elementary School, and that's a pretty diverse school as well. It's 47% African American, 25% white, 17% Hispanic, and a large percentage of that population is also low income. So I'm just really excited to learn more about multicultural education and to really become the expert on it because I think my second graders would get the best future possible if I can master this. Um, the topic that I chose was chapter 3, which is social class and education. And what it is about class levels and how where you come from, your background, your class affects the way you learn and the way you achieve. So let's dig into the chapter. Chapter objectives. Let's talk a little bit about it. Production and maintenance of social class inequalities in school. Areas which more research on social class and educational outcomes should be done. Ability groups versus tracking. Key factors of social class and access to higher education. Social class and educational privilege. The Coleman Report. Characteristics and education significance. I want you guys to meet someone. Meet my friend Peter. Peter is one odd poppy. Firstly, Peter. Peter's name is spelled Petar, not Peter. That is one of the things that makes him odd. But just look at him. Peter is one odd poppy. P. Production of social and economic inequalities in education. T. Tracking. A. Ability groups. R. Report by Coleman. O. Official knowledge and its distribution. P. Post-secondary sector access and outcomes. P. Privilege. I. Imagination. Globalize your imagination. 3.1 is our introduction to the chapter. It's the section that talks about economic and social inequalities in education. So, firstly, my first bullet talks about social class background. In the United States, social class or background is kind of hand in hand with race. We know that African Americans and Hispanics are usually in the working or the lower class. And so the chapter talks about that connection. Additionally, the chapter discusses Gomoran's prediction. And what that prediction is he says within the next 100 years, um, within education, the inequalities will balance themselves out. But his prediction has been criticized many times. Additionally, the chapter talks about race versus class in the United States. And really, like I said previously, race and class is kind of thought of as the same thing because, again, African Americans and Hispanics do make up that lower class in the United States. But you see, other minorities like maybe Asians may not be in that lower class. A lot of the times, too, and we're going to talk about this later in the chapter, immigrants kind of shake the classes and mix it up because sometimes they come to the United States and they jump classes, but the chapter does discuss that. And also, the chapter talks about class related stratification privileges, and what it is the education system, what is a system that's meant to educate all kids to a level that they can transcend the class that they're in, what it actually does is it privileges the already privileged. So children who already come from a privileged backgrounds are able to thrive within our education sector. However, kids from working class backgrounds typically do not. Now, that's not to say that there aren't one off situations where kids come from a background that is challenging and uses the education system to propel themselves to higher levels. But for the most part, the education system works in favor of those already privileged. Additionally, in this section, it discusses education related outcomes. So, A is academic achievement and attainment. So, what that is one, your ability to make great grades in school and to actually graduate and attain a certain level of education, and of course matriculate to the next level, bachelor's, master's, PhD. B, post secondary entrance and graduation. And what that speaks about specifically is college. How many of the children from the working class sector will graduate high school and continue on to a 4 year college, and not only go to that college, actually graduate from college? And C talks about short and long term employment opportunities and income. Because really, the goal of education at the end of the day is to graduate and get a good job, and not just a good job, a high paying job. And so, all of those things are looked at when talking about social and economic inequalities in the education sector. Okay, and so before we finish with this section, I also wanted to note that something very important was said in the chapter about social class and background. Pretty much the chapter stated that a parent's level of education, a parent's occupation, and income were all factors that were linked to achievement and attainment. And so I thought that was a really important takeaway from that section. So I wanted to make sure to note that. Secondly, we have tracking and ability grouping. So, in terms of ability grouping, Ray Riss did a study in the 1970, and the study was on a group of African American students. They were of kindergarten age, and he studied these students until they were in second grade. And what the study included was the teacher grouped the students not based on academic ability, but based on some assumptions of class. So she looked at the students in terms of their dress and also in terms of their speech and if they used neighborhood slang or if they spoke proper English. And she made assumptions based on that and their appearance to put them in ability groups. So the children who were dressed well and spoke well were put in the highest level of group, and the children who do not were put in the lowest level of groups. And there were three groups and three tables. And throughout the study, the teacher spent more time with the children that she put in the higher group. And throughout time, when Ray Riss studied these children actually became the academic performers. And the children in the lowest level did not perform at all. And most of the reasoning obviously was that the teacher treated them different and she spent more time with the children that she assumed would be more academically inclined by their appearance. Additionally, the students themselves started to react to this caste system that the study built. The children who were sat at the lower table or the lower performing groups, they were called dumb, and the children who were placed at the top performing group was called smart. And again, after 3 years of monitoring these children, what Ray Riss found is that the children actually lived up to those groups that they placed them in. So I say all of that to say that the chapter states that ability grouping in the early years can have long-term effects. So it could be very dangerous to group children this young. They begin to perform at expectation instead of transcending those groups. And so we want to be careful when grouping younger children. Additionally, the chapter also talks about tracking. And for those of you who don't know, tracking is in high school where they set you on a certain track. So maybe you're more academic, so your track will be the sciences or computers. Or maybe you're not that academically inclined, so your track will be something like barbering and wood shop, more tech savvy. So with this, it talked about how 50% of college attendance can be explained by the track placement system in high school. So it's really dangerous to put any age children in these groups because they kind of get boxed in. And one of my suggestions after the chapter would be to expose kids, even if they're in a certain track, if their interest is more wood shop or barbering or something of that nature, we expose them still to more academic subjects because you never know, they may still perform in those subjects. So definitely we want to be careful with that. Next, this was probably my favorite part of the chapter. This is the Coleman Report. And what it is in 1964, after the Civil Rights Act, the government ordered a survey to determine the extent to which the United States schools provided opportunities for minority children. And so Mr. Coleman did this report, and really the big question was, would more money pumped into underperforming schools and low incomes help these schools to perform and increase academic outcomes? And would the Coleman report found that differences in school is not really based on the funding of schools, it's based more on the socioeconomic background of the children. So pretty much what the report was saying is that privileged children perform better in school because of their background and vice versa for children from the working class. Additionally, the report also found that um, characteristics of schools really did not matter. And when I read this in the chapter, I found it really interesting. I really didn't agree with it, but I continued reading the chapter, so we're going to continue with the presentation and see how this might shift or change. So, Christopher Jenks was someone else who studied the same topic, and he pretty much came along and agreed with the Coleman report. And what he did is he added to the report with his volume. And so, what his study added is an actual number on it. So he said that by pumping more funds into lower performing schools and schools with children in the lower class and working class, it would only increase productivity and balance quality of schools by 1%. And that's what his report found. So it really backed the Coleman report. So this is probably my favorite part of the chapter here, rebuttals to the Coleman report. And the chapter really didn't say that these were rebuttals. After reading the chapter several times, this is kind of what I came up with. So there were a number of people that did their own studies on the same topic, and their findings actually goes against what the Coleman report stated. So pretty much they critiqued this report saying that underestimation of the importance of schooling based on use of verbal ability instead of what exactly is taught in school. So, meaning he didn't use a wide variety of measures of learning in order to get a clear picture on what was going on. So, Carver is someone who did a study on this same matter, and he came up with the fact that psychometric tests are poor measures of achievement, and students should be tested at the beginning of a period and at the end of that same period to assess learning. Now, when I read that, I was like, definitely, because I am a strong believer in that. You have to kind of give an entrance exam to figure out where the children are, teach the lesson, and at the end, give another exam to see exactly if they actually learned. So I definitely agree with what Mr. Carver said. And so Bowles and Levin also did a similar study, and theirs came up with there are many different variables to this topic, and Coleman just kind of stuck to one variable. So what they said was that teacher ratio should also be included in the study, per pupil expenditure should be included in the study, and they kind of critique the Coleman report, going deeper into it. Rudder was another person who talked about how characteristics of the school do lead to student success. And I absolutely believe that. And lastly, the chapter talked about how school plays a role in the reproduction of social class inequalities. And I think that's fair to say, especially when looking at these studies. Schools actually kind of any stereotypes, they kind of play into that instead of making sure that the results come out another way. The next section spoke about official knowledge and its distribution, and I thought that this section was really powerful. So, Michael F.D. said, what counts as school knowledge? So, pretty much what he means by that is really knowledge is controlled by whoever's in power or the majority group of people, and it embodies really their interests and their culture. And they control how that knowledge is distributed. And so that's really, really powerful. That can speak to why we see so many privileged children performing better in school, because, again, their parents are probably the ones controlling the type of knowledge that are in the schools. And the knowledge embodies, again, their culture and their interests. So another important section was the factors of production and reproduction of class. So one is organization of knowledge. Two, the form and transmission of that knowledge. Three, assessments of its acquisition. So Apple was someone else who studied this topic. And what he said is that school knowledge marginalizes the working class students because, again, it's not based on their culture, it's not based on their interests, and school knowledge really privileges the already privileged. Anion was someone else who studied the topic, and what he came up with is that knowledge is distributed mostly to the executive elite public schools, and it's more challenging in those schools. Knowledge in working class schools tends to be more redundant and an act of memorization and less challenging. And so we have to make sure that we expose children of a lower socioeconomic background to more challenging topics so that they can expand their minds. When you're not exposed or that knowledge is not distributed to you, you're not really aware of anything. And so he made that statement, and I definitely agree with it. He also said that working class students are less positioned for college. So the chapter really goes deeper into it, saying that at elite executive schools, they really prepare the children for college entrance exams. They edit their entrance exam essays, they edit their applications. It's more of a focus on going to college and not just college, more competitive schools and schools that are harder to get into. And so I think it's really important that teachers who work with lower class students do the same thing. We have to prepare them to be in power, just like if they were privileged children. Post secondary education is a key sorting ground for well paying and stable employment. So, this goes back to the last slide that talked about tracking. Really, in high school, once you group these kids and you do get them prepared for college or you don't, it really sorts out who's going to have that long-term employment and have a well-paying job and who's not. And so we really have to be careful when we group these children and we don't prepare them to go to college. We really have to support them as if they were going to a privileged or elite executive school. The next part of the chapter was post-secondary sector. It focused more on that and access and incomes. So I've already touched a little bit on this. And so what this section talked about is how the number of people attending college is increasing, but the level of inequality between classes is also increasing. So more privileged students attend selective colleges, but we don't have a wide variety of classes attending those selective colleges. Um, the chapter also spoke about how that increase is usually seen in the 2 year colleges, not really the 4 year colleges. So even though working class students are attending college, they are attending 4 year colleges or really competitive schools. Um, it also compared the years. So it talked about how in the early 90s there was a rise, and now we've seen that kind of balance off and going in the other direction. And it talks about reasons for that. So one reason is changes in financial aid policies. Two, the cost of college is increasing, but the family incomes is not in pace with that college increase. Three, it talks about how greater privileged students are being undermatched, and what undermatching is, and we probably talk about that later in the chapter, but what undermatching is when you qualify to attend a more prestigious school and you decide to attend a lesser school instead. So what that's doing is taking up spots for children who could only afford a certain level of school. They can't get into these schools because privileged children are actually electing to go to these less selective schools. State disinvestment in the public higher sector, and also decrease in charitable admissions. So the educational structure largely serves to maintain class inequalities, and that was the basis of that whole section. Next, we have this section on privilege, and this was a very interesting section as well. It spoke about one again how schools really make the privilege more privilege, and groups of privileged people seek to protect their level as being privileged. They want to pass that on to their children, and also it spoke about how working class students tend to never transcend the level that their parents was on, as this was doing back in like maybe the 40s. In the 40s and 50s, your parents might be, in the fields working, and you may end up, getting a job in a factory or working in an office. See, at this point, it's now leveling off to where working class students are on par with their parents and not transcending their parents' level. Um, Also, it talked about again the elite schools and the advantage they have because their teachers actually prepare them for the college application process. It talked about how these privileged students are actually prepared for powerful positions, to be in power, to be doctors and lawyers and white collar individuals. Additionally, it spoke about how their schools focus on tutoring, focus on prepping for college exams. And again, it spoke on undermatching, but I've already discussed that with you guys. Lastly, I thought this was really interesting right here. So, high selective institution equals higher persistent and graduation rates. So, really, when undermatching occurs, when this person goes to a lesser school and they were qualified to go to, usually the graduation rates are not as high as if they had went to a more challenging school. And I think that's another reason why we have to challenge our working class students, because when you challenge people, it creates more interest in the subject matter, and we're just expanding their horizons. So the last section of the chapter was about globalization, and I chose to use imagination as my first word. And really, we have to think bigger on this topic. This topic is not just the US, this topic is like a global topic. And I found this section really interesting because the section really spoke about me. Like I said, when I was 17, so 13 years ago, I came to this country as an international student, and I would like to believe that I am jumping the gap in classes from my parents by coming to a new country, and this is my third degree that I'm getting. So I found this section really interesting. So let's dig in. So it spoke about um, how we have to structure the study on a range of countries, and it talked about the different countries that we shouldn't just do first class countries like the US and Canada and Britain. We should kind of put a range in there, like the rising countries like Japan and South Africa. It spoke about all of that. Additionally, it talked about how the middle class is actually competing for jobs globally. Some of these jobs are being outsourced, and it's not just the factory or manufacturing jobs that are being outsourced. It talked about how some companies are seeking to hire white collar professionals from other countries. So there's more competition in the middle class at this point because of globalization. Additionally, this was probably one of my favorite points. It said immigrants often do well in their new countries and reach higher levels of achievement and attainment, sometimes moving classes. So that's how I summarize what it said in the chapter. But again, I use myself as an example, and I would like to think that I'm jumping the class gap by moving to another country and seeking to take advantage of all opportunities. So that's the gist of the chapter, but I really want to dig in and analyze it on a personal level. So these are some of the things that I got from the chapter in terms of combating inequalities in the classroom. So, one, we need to implement more resources with multicultural themes. A lot of times when I was subbing, I would purposely choose books that were based on African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, to just give my children that mix of culture. Additionally, I'd sometimes play a YouTube video from my native country, the Bahamas, or anything, African drums, just to really expose them to different cultures. Additionally, student input on learning topics. One of the most important parts of teaching is seeking student engagement. And so one way to do that is to ask the children what their interests are and what they want to learn about. So sometimes having that input would be really good for actually just helping them to open their minds to the topic. So focus on the college application process. And this is mainly for high school teachers, and also teach testing strategies. And I think that can be used for high school, middle school, or elementary school. So these more prestigious and elite schools are really focused on their testing strategies. And so I definitely think that that's something that we have to make sure that we expose our working class students to as well. Additionally, expose them to knowledge outside of their track. I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. So even if their track is more blue collar, we want to make sure that we still give them that one class that's outside of the box to still expand their horizons. So tracking should be based on, I believe, three things. So not just academic level at that point. I think you should also factor in interest and potential. Also, I stated before how I like the entrance and exit test to assess learning. So I definitely wanted to put that here as a key pointer to combating inequalities in the classroom, and also exposing high scholars to academic scholarships, competitions, and monitoring the application process. So really we need to try to just give these kids the opportunity, because sometimes, when we see someone with potential, we just need to show them the way and expose them to more. I know a lot of times when I was in college and in grad school, um, I only went to HBCUs, but I would always take part in competitions, and those competitions would sometimes go to more competitive schools like Duke and Ohio State, and it really exposed me to other students like me who, may have been more academically inclined or may have just had more resources. So I think it's really important to expose our children, even children from the labor class, to these opportunities. So right here, I wanted to dig in more with examples, and these are real world, real life examples that I know of combating inequalities in the school system. So I know of a middle school teacher. She used Nipsey Hussle, and the amount of albums he sold to introduce her math topic. Now, Nipsey was a really hot topic this year because he actually died. So all of the kids were talking about Nipsey Hussle. And I saw her actual math worksheet, and she used this popular rapper to get their interest. And really, what the worksheet was about was math, and they were more interested in how many albums he sold and how much money he made, not even noticing that it was just regular smegular math. So I thought that that was really interesting. Additionally, a good example right here that I saw is Walker Spivey Elementary School. They had a graduation and award ceremony for parent participation. Now, if you all don't know, this is the school that is in the poorest neighborhood in Fayetteville, a very low income neighborhood. And so they wanted to increase parent participation. And parent participation is so important when it comes to balancing this playing field, leveling it out, and making sure that our working class students have the same opportunity. When we get parents engaged, they tend to help with homework, make sure homework is done. They show up for parent teacher meetings, and we can really work as a team to make sure that their child is getting the most out of school. Another example I have is Bethune-Cookman University, which was the college that I went to. I was able to actually visit Ohio State and be offered a scholarship to attend graduate school at Ohio State. So Bethune-Cookman University is HBCU, and Ohio State is a really, really good competitive school. And so I would have never had that opportunity if I wasn't given that chance to participate in the competition. So I thought that that was a really good example of, transcending classes. Lastly, um, I heard about a situation where there was a school in an at-risk neighborhood, and they partnered with an what we would call in this chapter an elite executive school, and they were actually going to the same museum. And so what the teachers decided to do is pair one student from the at-risk school with one student from the elite executive school together for that day to buddy. And what it did is it exposed children to different cultures, and really they were able to open their minds in the museum. So I thought these were real good real world examples. So has to be my favorite slide because it talks about what I really learned and what I'm gonna adapt to my second grade classroom. So Miss Sampson and her multicultural classroom. So one, I will display images of diverse white collar professionals all around my class. Two, I will host minority guest speakers for career day. Three, I will prepare students for positions of power. So all my students, no matter where they came from, I really believe in giving them that head start, that preparation. Really, we have to believe in our students for them to believe in themselves. And again, parent engagement is extremely important. So four, I will provide free tutoring to my students, just how students at elite executive schools, there's a focus on tutoring. I believe that we have to adopt those same standards even if we are at low income schools. Another standard that I set in place for my classroom is to ensure that they have access to more challenging materials and activities. So what I plan to do is to buddy with a teacher I know at the top public school in Fayetteville and really just assess what she's doing with her class and try to adopt some of those successful practices into my class. Also, I plan to limit grouping for second graders because from this chapter I've learned that when you group students so early and you put them in those ability groups, it could kind of block them in. I plan to implement more cooperative learning groups. And what a cooperative learning group is, for those who don't know, it's when you pour, let's say you have a group of 4 students. You're gonna put one high performer, you're gonna put 2 middle of the pack, and lastly you're gonna put one lower performance student. You're going to put them all in one group to collaborate. I believe that students sometimes push other students to perform, and so I think that's a healthier group than the ability groups. Also, I want to implement lessons based on children's interests and culture, like my Nipsey Hussle example. I'm a strong believer in seeing what the kids are into. In my third grade class in the morning, they wanted to listen to Old Time Road to get them hyped up. That's what I would do. If I had to give an example of of the game that they play, Minecraft, in my math lesson, that's what I'll do. So I definitely believe in connecting with children first and building those relationships, and then trying to reach the standards once that bond is built. So takeaways from the chapter. I think really what I got from this chapter is yes, we need funding because funding equals better resources. But we don't just need better resources, we need parent engagement and we need the teachers to be aware of the inequalities in the classroom. Once we're aware of these inequalities in the classroom, we need to pour our attention and our efforts into these children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and we need to help balance the inequalities. Also, I think we need to prioritize parent engagement. It has to be of the utmost importance. We need to get to know our students and we need to build relationships. That concludes my presentation. Here are my references. I didn't just use the textbook for the presentation. I tried to do some research and read some articles on more ways that I can balance the inequality in schools based on socioeconomic backgrounds. This concludes my presentation on social class and education. Thank you so much. Chapter objectives. Let's talk a little bit about it. Production and maintenance of social class inequalities in school. Areas which more research on social class and educational outcomes should be done. Ability groups versus tracking. Key factors of social class and access to higher education. Social class and educational privilege. The Coleman Report. Characteristics and education significance. I want you guys to meet someone. Meet my friend Peter. Peter is one odd poppy. Firstly, Peter. Peter's name is spelled Petar, not Peter. That is one of the things that makes him odd. But just look at him. Peter is one odd poppy. P. Production of social and economic inequalities in education. T. Tracking. A. Ability groups. R. Report by Coleman. O. Official knowledge and its distribution. P. Post-secondary sector access and outcomes. P. Privilege. I. Imagination. Globalize your imagination. 3.1 is our introduction to the chapter. It's the section that talks about economic and social inequalities in education. So, firstly, my first bullet talks about social class background. In the United States, social class or background is kind of hand in hand with race. We know that African Americans and Hispanics are usually in the working or the lower class. And so the chapter talks about that connection. Additionally, the chapter discusses Gomoran's prediction. And what that prediction is he says within the next 100 years, within education, the inequalities will balance themselves out. But his prediction has been criticized many times. Additionally, the chapter talks about race versus class in the United States. And really, like I said previously, race and class is kind of thought of as the same thing because, again, African Americans and Hispanics do make up that lower class in the United States. But you see, other minorities like maybe Asians may not be in that lower class. A lot of the times, too, and we're going to talk about this later in the chapter, immigrants kind of shake the classes and mix it up because sometimes they come to the United States and they jump classes, but the chapter does discuss that. And also, the chapter talks about class related stratification, privileges, and what it is the education system. What is a system that's meant to educate all kids to a level that they can transcend the class that they're in. What it actually does is it privileges the already privileged. So children who already come from a privileged backgrounds are able to thrive within our education sector. However, kids from working class backgrounds typically do not. Now, that's not to say that there aren't one off situations where kids come from a background that is challenging and uses the education system to propel themselves to higher levels. But for the most part, the education system works in favor of those already privileged. Additionally, in this section, it discusses education related outcomes. So, A is academic achievement and attainment. So, what that is one, your ability to make great grades in school and to actually graduate and to attain a certain level of education, and of course matriculate to the next level, bachelor's, master's, PhD. B, post-secondary entrance and graduation. And what that speaks about specifically is college. How many of the children from the working class sector will graduate high school and continue on to a 4-year college and not only go to that college, actually graduate from college? And C talks about short and long term employment opportunities and income. Because really, the goal of education at the end of the day is to graduate and get a good job, and not just a good job, a high paying job. And so, All of those things are looked at when talking about social and economic inequalities in the education sector. Hi, my name is Shanae Sampson. I'm a first year graduate student here at Fayetteville State in the Masters of Arts of Teaching program. My major is elementary education with a concentration in math. Most recently, I've been a substitute teacher, um, long term assignment at JW Seabrook in Cedar Creek. That is a very diverse school. So, this multicultural education class and diverse learning is something that really does interest me. Additionally, I came to this country as an international student, and I really believe in being able to connect with all of our students, regardless of their background, and to put everyone on a level playing field so that children can seek success and achieve a success. Um, Actually, I just accepted a job at Cumberland Mills Elementary School, and that's a pretty diverse school as well. It's 47% African American, 25% white, 17% Hispanic, and a large percentage of that population is also low income. So I'm just really excited to learn more about multicultural education and to really become the expert on it because I think my second graders would get the best future possible if I can master this. Um, the topic that I chose was chapter 3, which is social class and education. And what it is about class levels and how where you come from, your background, your class affects the way you learn and the way you achieve. So let's dig into the chapter.